So most videos I put out on the channel, almost every single video, is always thinking in context of, what the audience wants to see. Oh, everybody wants to hear me talk about the market today or talk about stocks I'm buying or whatever, right? Let me be very clear. Today's video is about me. It's not about the audience today, although I think some of you, if you ever go through an addiction situation, you'll be able to learn something from this video on, because I'm going to take you through the whole process of kind of how it happened, how it worked through, how it became a full-blown addiction, and the recovery process and kind of my plans for that as well. And I feel like it's a big moment, and I feel like this is going to be a video I look back on 6 months, 12 months, 3 years, 5 years from now, and be proud that I admitted that, and I was able to put a good quality video together and be able to move on from the situation, because I feel like I can't move on fully until I discuss this in a serious manner and really talk about this, and hopefully everybody can learn a little bit from this here today. So do I feel shame in having to do a video like this? To admit an addiction is very difficult, and especially to do it publicly. I personally do not feel any shame in having to admit I basically got an addiction, but I can understand why others would feel shame, because it's not fun to admit that you went down a very bad path that was very self-destructive, right? It's not the most fun thing to admit, especially as a man or even a woman, right? It's just not fun to have to admit that, and especially do it publicly. But I feel like for me, it's the most important thing, and it's how I even start to move forward and to start to recover. Now, in terms of the stages of progression when it comes to addiction, right? It just starts out with a little whatever it is, right? And there's so many forms of addiction in this world. It just starts out with, something a little harmless, nothing too major, right? And then over time, you kind of like need more of that, right? And then you slowly kind of morph into a full-blown addiction. And then you reach this point where it's either you're going to admit you have an addiction, right? I'm an addict. I have it right there, right? I'm an addict, or you're not. And as somebody that's known a lot of folks, unfortunately, over the years that have battled addiction problems, I can tell you most of them were never able to get over the addiction problem because they couldn't even get to that step of admitting they're an addict. And if you try to confront them on it, right, they'd say, oh, no, it's no, I don't have that problem. I could quit tomorrow, or it's not a problem. It's not an issue, right? And sometimes you can see it so easily, right? You're like, oh my gosh, this person's an addict. Like, how do they not see this? I'm bringing it out to them and they're just in denial. They're just like, I don't know, I don't have a problem. Oh no, it's not an addiction, right? And it's sad and it's unfortunate. It's hard for a lot of us that, might have, potentially friends or family members or whatever that have had to deal with different forms of addiction. And you're sitting there and you're like, how do they really not see it? And they really don't want to get better, right? Now, for some folks, they can get to that point where they say, I'm an addict, and they start to recover. And we're going to talk about the recovery process and those sorts of things, right? But it's a choice. And no one can make that choice other than that individual. If you can't make the choice for that loved one or that friend or whatever that you see is become an addict in whatever they're an addict in, right? They have to be the one to make that choice. And it really starts with them. And if they can admit that, then they can actually start the recovery process. But if somebody else has to do it for them, there's no hope. And you can ask anybody that's an expert on this field, they'll tell you exactly that, right? And I think it comes down to three things usually why somebody can't admit they're an addict. One is pride. They're just too prideful. They don't want to, it hurts their pride and ego too much, right? The second one is just straight up denial of like, no, it's not an issue. It's not a problem. No, right? And then the third one is just if they're so far gone that there's just like no bringing them back, right? And that's usually how somebody doesn't even enter the addict phase. For me, I've been able to admit I'm an addict, and that way I can start the recovery process, and we'll go through all that in this video, right? Now, if we look at my adult life really started in 2009. I graduated high school in 2008, and so 2009 I really felt like my adult life started, right? And I come up with this blueprint of, how to invest in the market. I steal basically a lot of Warren Buffett and Peter Lynch principles, and I adapt my own little strategy on top of that. I work hard, I stick to the blueprint, stay disciplined, and I have a tremendous amount of financial success over those next 5 years. And I get to places that, for somebody like myself that started out as a minimum wage worker, there wasn't a lot of hope. And next thing you know, I had several $100,000 in stocks. I had a lot of success in the market, and I stuck to my game plan, buying profitable companies, buying great balance sheet companies, proven business models that had growth in the future, right, at fair values or undervalued valuations. And I stayed very, very disciplined, worked my butt off, disciplined, invested, did everything right. And I came up with this blueprint that was it was phenomenal. It was absolutely amazing. Okay. And then it actually started at the end of 2014, but in 2015, 2016, I become an addict. So this it's not the first time I've had to deal with, an addiction problem. Let's call it that, okay? But in 2015, 2016, I started going against my entire blueprint that I had. I started doing things that I knew I should not be doing. That's the thing. Like, you're an addict when you're doing things that you know you should not be doing this. And I started getting into things like margin. And I already knew about margin for a long time. And I knew you don't mess with margin. And I knew Warren Buffett's philosophy on margin. If you're dumb, you have no place using it, and if you're smart, you don't need it, right? And I started getting into super heavy margin, which is essentially investing $1 for every dollar you have. I started doing all this swing trading crap. I got into a company that was unprofitable and started loading up on a stock that was unprofitable, and I just became a pathetic stock junkie. I would describe it as that, which is I was no longer an investor. I was no longer this disciplined investor that had this blueprint. I was a stock market junkie. I was looking for the thrill of the next, earnings trade. Oh, let me put 50,000 in this stock. Oh, let me put 100,000 here. Oh, let's trade in out of this now to 70,000 there. And I became a full-blown stock market junkie, gambling addict, I would call it. And it's very sad, to look back at that stage, but it was a stage I went through nonetheless, right? So, coming off that stage, I realized, I got a problem, right? And I admit I'm an addict, and I start, finding help, and I start, recovering, right? I get back to the blueprint, start working hard again, and I stick to the blueprint for many, many years. And 2017 through 2021, it was like I had ridiculous performance in stocks. I had winners everywhere, and I discuss that even in this video. I talk about the public account. I show screenshots of everything, right, in that particular video. And a success, right, comes to me again as I get back to my blueprint, and I stay focused and I stay disciplined. And, the success just piled in terms of my YouTube success, in terms of my performance in the market, in terms of my outperformance in the market, in terms of my outperformance of stocks. And it was unbelievable, to be quite frank. And then slowly, something starts to change. And it started in about the first quarter of 2021, kind of the end of the first quarter of 2021, beginning of the second quarter of 2021. And what happens is I slowly start to drift away from the blueprint. And I start buying several unprofitable stocks, several of them. It wasn't like it was one, right? Start buying several. And I would call this stage kind of like, if you ever known somebody that's an alcoholic, it's kind of like, I just drink to be social stage, right? Where it wasn't an issue yet at that moment in time. But you kind of looked at it and it's like, this has the writing on the wall of potentially being an issue, right? And this is what I call the addict emerges phase that I kind of went through there, where it's kind of like, oh boy, he might be going down the wrong path here. He might be getting away from everything that ever made him successful, right? And the next thing you know, from the third quarter of 2021 through the third quarter of 2022, I became a full-blown addict. The blueprint by this point in time is completely out the window. Everything that ever made me successful, I was completely away from that. It was like night and day image. It's like it's not even the same thing. And I went away from everything that made me successful. I started loading up on almost all unprofitable companies. Almost all the companies I was buying, unprofitable stocks, which is not part of the blueprint. And this is so far gone at this point in time that it's hard to even, how did we even get here? Get here, right? Got to a point where I didn't listen to anybody, which is obviously definitely a form of, addiction when you just aren't even listening to anybody, right? And I became a full-blown junkie for unprofitable stocks. And the thrill of buying these unprofitable stocks and it's going to be the big winner. Oh, this one. And no longer investing in a disciplined way, simply becoming a gambling speculator. When you are buying nothing but unprofitable stocks, first off, an unprofitable company is a speculative company. nothing wrong with owning a speculative company, right? No different than there's nothing wrong with, having a beer at dinner or something like that, right? But there is a problem if you drink all day, right? And there is a problem if you are loading up on all unprofitable companies and all you're doing is starting to speculate in companies that don't have proven business models and are money losers. And you're going away from everything that ever made you successful. That's a recipe for disaster. You are now a full-blown addict at that point in time. And that's exactly what I became. I became a full-blown addict, right? And what did I get for going against the blueprint? What did I get for becoming an addict, right? Well, I got massive, and I mean massive, underperformance in the market in a colossal way. Awful returns. Embarrassing for somebody like myself. I got into a several-year hole it's going to take me to climb out of in terms of, climbing back to record numbers. It's going to take me years to get back there, right? The only good thing that maybe came from it is now I'm not going to have taxes to pay for the next few years because I'm going to have a lot of write-offs. So that's, I guess, something good. No sub growth on YouTube, which was just, in the past you couldn't even conceive that. My sub growth hasn't grown in a year, right? Which is very telling that the audience didn't approve of the Jeremy I became, of a full-blown addict, right? And, usually I gain 50,000 to 150,000 subscribers a year. To not grow at all, that there's a little sign there that you've gone off the rails, right? And obviously it became a punching bag, but to be fair, I think every big YouTuber in the finance space has become a punching bag this year. So I'm definitely not the only one. I'm just one of many, right? So what did I get for going against my blueprint? Nothing. I got less success everywhere. And, that could be said for YouTube. That could be said for performance. It doesn't matter what you look at, whatever metric. It all ended up like, what are we doing here? Horrible decisions. Full-blown addict, right? Now that we, discussed how we became an addict and the admission of addict, right? And enter in recovery, like how do you not relapse, right? Because that's the issue, is relapse, right? And I've had already a relapse issue, right? It's just several years apart, and next thing you know, I relapsed into something else, right? So how do I make sure you don't relapse? Well, a few things, right? You got to avoid triggers, you got to ramp up your treatment, and you got to build a support system around you, right? So how am I essentially doing this so I don't relapse in the future, right? Well, avoid the triggers, right? So if it's a net loss company, I'm not even looking into it. Because the thing is, once you start going down that rabbit hole of research, right, into a company that's losing money, you start to obviously want to potentially invest in it, right? If I don't look into the company, if I see, they lose money and I avoid it, right? Then I'm not going to fall into the trap of let me buy an unprofitable stock when I already got 1 million of those, right? So don't look, no research. If I don't look and I don't research, at the end of the day, I'm going to avoid those triggers of even potentially investing in a stock, right? Ramp up treatment. At the end of the day, it's going to be very simple. Am I buying unprofitable stock with unproven business models? And if I'm staying away from unprofitable stocks with unproven business models, then my treatment's going right? And building a support system, which is exactly what I'm doing. Because I know with me, I'm going to likely be fine for at least the next few years, right? And I'm not going to fall into any traps in the next few years. But I do worry about 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 7 years from now, about going into the same trap again. But the difference is it will be a much bigger dollar amount. Because as we know, as your net worth grows over time, right? Obviously the dollar amounts get more substantial, right? The amount of money I've, cost myself becoming a full-blown addict this time versus obviously the 2015, it's immensely more because my net worth is obviously much higher, right? So I'm basically kind of setting up my board of directors on the DL right now. And I had a tremendous amount of folks apply for the Munger application. First off, for everybody that did that, thank you. And I'm still reaching out to people, and I still will reach out over the next probably month or so. It was insane to go through those. So many quality folks, and I just thank you guys for all doing that, right? And basically, I'm going to build out 5 to 7 people that I'm going to be able to keep close contact with, and are going to be able to not just talk the markets with and stocks and opinions and those sorts of things, but have these folks keep me in check. So if they ever see me going down the wrong path drifting away from my blueprint, they're going to be able to pull me in and be like, hey man, what are you doing here? Because I haven't had that in my life. I didn't have that in 2015, 2016. I didn't have that obviously today. So it's just kind of happening on the DL. Some of these folks you guys might know, some of them you don't know. But yeah, it's still going to be a process. And it's kind of like my board of directors to kind of keep me in check in those sorts of things, right? I'm also going to encourage a lot more bear theses in the private group and make that a very encouraged thing. In terms of where I spend most of my time discussing stocks with folks, it's in the private stock group, right? In the Discord chat. And I'm going to make sure, I feel like I and many others weren't as welcoming to bear theses, and I want to, even as bulls, I want us to come up with bear theses of stocks. Here's what can go wrong, the risk factors, and those sorts of things. So the group can just build into a much healthier overall balanced group over the next several years, obviously, than maybe we were in the past, where we were maybe only looking at upside and only looking at bullish scenarios. So those are the changes I'm making to obviously make sure I don't relapse into this situation here, right? Now, in 2023 and beyond, where do I go from here, right? So it's back to the blueprint. Proven growth business models. Proven growth business models. Not some companies that just went public in the past year or two. Proven growth business models that have been in the public markets, and they've proven that they can be sustainably profitable, sustainably good companies, right? Get back to great long-term prospects in companies. Get back to companies that have net income, not net loss, net income. Get back to companies that have great balance sheets. Get back to companies that have forward Ps under 30 and under 20 is ideal. And also get back to, something I will say I've been able to stay pretty good with is buying the dip in diversity. It's just the difference is I was buying the dip in all unprofitable companies. So moving forward, obviously, it's buying the dip in profitable, proven business models that are at very attractive valuations, which in this market and for this market for the next year, it's not going to be a hard thing necessarily. There's a lot of companies that are very undervalued, that are great proven business models, that have track records, that have great management teams, that are very fair. PE ratios now at this point in time, and maybe even very undervalued at this point in time. It's not hard to find those. And so that's what we're getting back to, okay? Now, in terms of YouTube, I'm going to use my platform to get back to the blueprint and preach the blueprint. I'm preaching what made me successful in the end, right? I'm also going to warn of this addiction phase that I've gone through, right? To hopefully prevent future folks from kind of going down that rabbit hole. And with me, I think the best thing to happen was those stocks do so bad, right? All the unprofitable companies. And we could blame that on inflation, could blame it on the Fed, could blame it on, bad management teams and, blah, blah, blah. We could blame it on a million things, but at the end of the day, I shouldn't have been loading up on countless unprofitable stocks. It's absolutely ridiculous, right? So the best thing that ever happened to me was that those, obviously fell massively, because that allows you to wake up. If you just keep getting a positive reinforcement, you're just going to go further and further down the addiction route, right? So I'm going to warn of this, obviously, not just in future months, but future years. And ultimately, I'll become the best version of myself over the next several years. And, staying disciplined, staying back to the blueprint, buying great companies, proven business models, undervalued valuations, and becoming the strongest version of myself. And, there was I don't know if you guys ever saw the original Wall Street movie, but I think this is just kind of a great thing to leave it off here. Lou Manheim, who's this guy, he tells Bud Fox in the movie, remember, there are no shortcuts, son. Quick buck artists come in every bull market, but the steady players make it through the bear markets, right? And the same could be said for companies. There will be some that don't make it through this bear market, and there'll be others that do, right? And so for me, it's about investing in the sort of companies that can get through any market. And, it doesn't matter if there's inflation, deflation, doesn't matter if there's, a bad economy, a great economy, an okay economy, doesn't matter. They're going to be profitable. They're going to have a successful business, and they will make it regardless, right? And so for me, it's about getting back to those sorts of companies and making the investments and placing my capital there and being a good preacher of the blueprint, right? Which is something I came up with many, many years ago, and obviously it's made me tremendously successful. And every single time I've gotten away from the blueprint, we know what happens. It ends in complete disaster, and it's happened twice now, and twice in the past 14 years, and I want to make sure that never happens again. So appreciate you guys. Much love as always. Like I said, I think there's a video I'll look back on in the future and be very proud I put out. So I appreciate everybody for joining me. As always, back to the regularly scheduled programming starting tomorrow. Much love. Appreciate you. Have a great day.